Hi, I'm Susan Freeman. Welcome back to our Propertyshe podcast series brought to you by Mishcon de Reya in association with the London Real Estate Forum, where I get to interview the key influencers in the world of real estate and the built environment. We're recording the podcast digitally, so please do bear with us if the sound quality isn't up to normal studio standard. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Rebeca Guzman Vidal. Rebeca is the Group Head of Retail at international investor, asset manager and developer Chelsfield, where she works on retail strategy across a global portfolio that spans gateway cities including London, Paris, New York and Hong Kong. Chelsfield is currently redeveloping a third of the 3.5-acre Knightsbridge estate, a mixed-use retail-led portfolio in London on behalf of owner the Alain Group. Rebeca is heavily involved in bringing new retailers to the development and leveraging relationships that cross over into the Paris and New York portfolios. More recently, she's also been focusing on refining the long-term retail strategy of the portfolio to ensure its resilience as the world prepares for a global recovery. In Paris, Rebeca is working on projects on Avenue Montaigne that will significantly change the retail landscape of the Triangle, whereas in New York, she's working closely with the team in delivering a best-in-class amenities and retail strategy for the redevelopment of 550 Madison Avenue. Prior to joining Chelsfield, Rebeca worked at CBRE, where she was part of the London Retail Advisory Team, working for some of London's major landlords, including Grosvenor, the Crown Estate, Cadogan Estate, and Great Portland Estates. She specialised in luxury assets and worked on a number of high-profile placemaking schemes, including Regent Street, Sloane Street, and Mount Street. And now we're going to hear from Rebeca with her thoughts on what she sees as both the short and long-term future of international retail. Rebeca, welcome to the digital studio. It's great to have you on here because I know that you also host your own podcast, so it's great to have you here as a guest.
Hi Susan, great to be here.
And I have to ask you this. You have the most fascinating accent, and I can't quite place it, but clearly you weren't born in London. So where did you start? Where were you educated?
So I was born in South America. I was born in Venezuela. My mother is Spanish. My father is Peruvian. So I grew up a little bit in South America, and then we moved to Spain when I was young. So I sort of, I went to school there. I moved to London when I was 18 to do university here, which was great. And basically, I've sort of been here ever since, even though I've managed to also live in Paris, in Milan, and in Hong Kong in between. But I consider myself a Londoner by adoption and a Latino by heart.
That is a terrific. And was it always a foregone conclusion that you were going to go into real estate?
No, it's probably the short answer. So I've always been fascinated with the luxury. And so it's no surprise that when I went to university, I decided to study French and Italian. So I always thought I was going to go into the sort of fashion industry when I graduated. But I quickly realized that it was a very crowded market. And at the time, I think if you were either French or Italian, you really had an edge. I think, funnily enough, that has completely changed. But I realized I did some internships in real estate companies, including Cushman & Wakefield. And I realized that for luxury brands, real estate is really the most important part of their strategy. So I thought it was a great opportunity to go into real estate and actually almost sort of satisfy my love for buildings and architecture at the same time as I could end up effectively working alongside these luxury brands and kind of learning from them. So I think I've done pretty well on that front, actually.
No, I think that's a terrific way of arriving at real estate. So it sounds as if you are in the ideal role for you as group head of retail at Chelsfield, and there is obviously an international element to that role. How can you tell us a little bit about what your role entails on a day-to-day basis?
Of course. So I effectively exist at Chelsfield to connect the dots. So my responsibility is to ensure that we've got a cohesive retail strategy across the board. So we have a portfolio that spans Asia in the form of a fund, which therefore invests in property and then kind of exits within 5 to 7 years. So it's quite a traditional format. And we invest across offices, residential and retail. And then the rest of the portfolio is a much longer term hold that we asset manage and develop manage on behalf of the Olean Group. And that spans New York, Paris and London. So really my responsibility is to make sure that we have the right strategy for each asset and that we are speaking to the right brands at the right point in time. And when I say connecting the dots, it's really leveraging the relationships that either I have personally or we as a group, as a business have, to make sure that we are growing and nurturing those relationships as best we can at a global scale.
So, I mean, one of your big projects is in London, the Knightsbridge estate, which I think is like 3.5 acres, which is huge in the middle of central London. And you are, I mean, you have been for a little while, been involved in bringing new retailers and new concepts to the development. And that is a lot to think about at the best of times, but we've now got the whole COVID situation overlaid on that. So what sort of retailers are you targeting, and has anything changed as we've proceeded through a whole year of COVID lockdowns?
I think in short, yes, everything has changed. Virtually everything has changed. I'm spending a lot of time right now speaking to the wider team about our repositioning strategy. So we really believe that Knightsbridge and some of the other prime areas in London are poised to come back and come back very strongly. But we're also hugely aware of the fact that customers coming back into town are going to want much more. And I think really this is a case of kind of working twice as hard to stand still and therefore thrice as hard probably to thrive post-COVID. So whereas previously I think we were very much looking at a strategy that was predicated on retail first, then F&B, and then kind of all the other, amenity style uses that support our residential and our offices, I think that balance is starting to tilt. And I mean, I personally believe as a consumer, we're going to want to come back into the city centre to experience things, and particularly things that you cannot replicate online. So food, of course, is a huge part of that, but also, things that are to do with wellness, with health, with beauty, smelling things, touching things, hearing things that, as I say, a lot of these things you really can't do online. And therefore, if you can't replicate it, then I think there's a very good chance that people will want to come back into the stores and into the restaurants and the cafes.
And are you seeing a similar shift across the world of retail? So, you're looking at New York, you're looking at Paris, you're looking at Hong Kong. I mean, are there similar issues and concerns, or are different parts of the world at different stages?
I think Asia is always kind of at the forefront in everything. And I know when you and I spoke last week, we were talking about Raymond Chow, who's the head of retail at Hong Kong Land, who just gave this amazing presentation at the ULI European conference around how Asian landlords and Asian retailers are responding to the changes that COVID has brought about. And I do think they're a few steps ahead of us in understanding, first of all, the importance of experiential retail, but then also understanding the importance of having flexibility, bringing freshness to an asset, therefore having pop-ups as a part of your strategy rather than an afterthought, if that makes sense. But I do think, setting that aside, there's a huge amount of similarity between what's happening in London, in Paris, in cities that we're not kind of operating in, because I think ultimately the consumer is becoming a lot more homogenous, particularly the younger shoppers. They care about broadly some big topics, whether it's climate change or the wider ESG agenda. They care about sustainability in terms of how we bring clothes to stores, in terms of how clothes are produced, where our food comes from, how it travels. So I actually think all those changes are perhaps happening at a different rate in each city, but they're happening all around. We all ultimately want to live better, longer, healthier lives.
It's interesting. Raymond Chow was talking, very much about the young consumer, and that's something that came up quite a lot in his presentation. And yet, it's the older consumers that actually have the disposable income. So he seemed to be saying that the young consumer was very important. Also, art and culture, and it gets back to what you were saying about experience. People want an experience, and I just wondered, if you look at the sort of shopping centre or the high street in a few years' time, what percentage will be retail? What percentage will be F&B? What percentage will be just sport and leisure type opportunities?
That's a good question. I think I'm starting to rethink the answer to this as I get asked this quite often. I personally think that we're going to come to a point where the tipping point between non-traditional retail and retail is reached, meaning traditional retail, be it apparel or accessories or lifestyle brands, will occupy around 50% of our spaces. And then literally the rest will be a combination of F&B, culture, wellness, fitness, because again, going back to my earlier point, if we don't genuinely give consumers the reason to come back, if we allow online to forever be more convenient, then we cannot expect the high street to survive, let alone thrive.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And so Oxford Street, Westminster have, this week come up with, some plans for the future of Oxford Street, and obviously lost Debenhams, lost Arcadia. There are a lot of gaps on Oxford Street. How do you see that following a similar pattern then with the 50% retail?
Absolutely. I think, Oxford Street and many of our high streets are arguably, they're starved for experiences. And I think some of the larger retailers, whether it's John Lewis or Selfridges or Nike or even Topshop, even though at the moment it looks like it's never going to reopen, at least in that kind of iteration. I think they sort of took on the responsibility of bringing experience to Oxford Street. But what it really is missing is, what about the food? What about that moment where you can just grab something, sit near some trees or some planting and have a moment of respite before you continue on with your day? It's lacking experiences. I know you and I spoke about things like Color Factory and the Museum of Ice Cream in the US. There's a brilliant brand that is basically reimagining what the toy store will look like, called Camp. And I think it's based out of New York, but they've got several stores now in the US. And what they do is really clever. They've got a sort of traditional retail shop on the front part of the store. So when you enter, you just think, oh, they sell like beautiful toys and books, etc. And then they've got a sort of secret passage into a much bigger part of the store, which is basically all for kids to have experiences in. So they can have learning experiences, they can play around with toys and buy them. And what that really creates is a community. And I think that's exactly what Oxford Street is lacking. I mean, if I were honest, I would also say I think that's what we're lacking on the Knightsbridge estate too. We need experiences like that to get people to come back into town, rather than just relying on, some of our anchors, be it Harrods or Harvey Nichols or Hyde Park. We really need to give people reasons to come back.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned Harrods, and traditionally the department stores, and certainly when they first started, were absolutely what you're talking about. They were experiential. It was a voyage of discovery, and you're finding new things. And somehow they lost that element of showmanship and just became, fairly boring. I mean, do you see department stores, rediscovering their original purpose? Because concept stores seem to do quite well. I mean, could we see a new wave of department stores that actually do what they originally intended to do?
I think so, very much so, but particularly those that have shown that they are willing to pivot. in the age of kind of post-COVID. I think Harrods is a really good example. Selfridge is a good example. When I say pivot, I think one of the biggest themes that is emerging from COVID is this idea of localization and the sort of rise of the local customer. And what that local customer means to different department stores will be very different, of course. But I think they're, in their original kind of ways, they used to really be about the local customer. They used to be about delighting and bringing different things to town that you couldn't find anywhere else. And I do think they're going back to that, albeit under very different strategies. To me, it's very clear that Harrods are really pinning their hopes on the sort of the global VIP customer that may have a home in London, but they may also have a home in Singapore. They may also have a home in LA, but they understand that customer and they're sticking to that. And I think that's really powerful. And Selfridges perhaps are looking at a slightly younger customer base, slightly broader customer base, but again, they're sticking to their guns, that they really understand what that shopper is looking for, and they're just, they're going for it. They had this amazing campaign a few weeks ago called Project Earth, which was all around sustainability and, in the supply chain of clothing and accessories. And it was really powerful and really well received. And I think that really spoke to that kind of Gen Z shopper that they really target.
Yes, and Selfridges reinvented themselves as
totally
the whole sort of experiential thing a few years back, and then of course some of the other department stores which have now gone just didn't do that. And in terms of the brands that you are seeing and looking at across the portfolio, what sort of retail brands are going to prove resilient and come out of this stronger? Because we hear a lot about the death of the high street because of online, and you get exceptions to the rule like Primark, who are not online. So are you seeing sort of any particular features of brands that make it clear that they will come out stronger at the other end of this?
I think so, yeah. There's definitely a tale of kind of winners and losers. There's a huge amount of both polarization and consolidation happening in the retail industry. In fact, it's happening in the F&B industry too. So I do think, bigger groups, those that are more diversified, that are both geographically and merchandise-wise. So, whether it's PVH or VF Corp in America, or whether it's LVMH or Kering in France, those are the brands, or rather the groups, that will come out stronger. That said, I also think the consumer, because they have more choice than ever, that they're going to kind of either go for the really, really big brands because they feel they provide, good value for money. So Inditex, H&M, Primark, to your point, or they're going to go for independent brands because at the end of the day, I also think as consumers, we strive to find, that thing that will differentiate us, that thing that will make us feel part of another tribe. So I do think there's particularly online-based businesses that will thrive after this, because the one thing we also have all understood is that online e-commerce, it's here to stay. It's forced a lot of people to realize just how convenient it is. There's also a degree of pricing transparency that you don't get in physical spaces. So I think any brand that understands that, be it small or big, is going to thrive after this.
Yes, obviously we've all been buying online, during lockdown, and it's easy and convenient, but you do lose something because you can't really tell what the fabric's going to be like, as you say, you can't touch it. And if you like shopping, you like browsing, you like actually sort of going somewhere and seeing something that you hadn't thought about, and that doesn't really happen. Online. So what about the online brands, the digitally native retail brands that seem to, they seem to sort of indicate that you can't do everything online. They are migrating offline. I mean, do you see more of that? And can a retail fashion brand survive solely online without any sort of flagship or showcase for people to see the product?
I don't think they can. I mean, of course I would say that. I work in real estate. I'm hugely biased, but I do genuinely think there is a natural glass ceiling, because even in a world, by 2025, depending on which country you live in, UK, US, Germany, France, Asia, certainly, a huge chunk of spend is going to happen online, but the bulk of it is going to be convenience led, meaning groceries or regular purchases. So if you're a brand that is looking to scale, you can't possibly expect customers to just keep buying things without being able to see them. And also, you can see, even pre-COVID, you can see just the amount of digitally native brands that were looking at physical spaces as a means to, grow brand awareness, grow, customer acquisition, grow market share. Because effectively, even though we all, I think as an industry, we complain about how inefficient and how costly can real estate be. It is still one of the most cost-effective ways to acquire new customers, especially in a world where right now, post-COVID, everyone is looking at ways to kind of capture our eyeballs. And therefore, marketing online is becoming more expensive. It's becoming more crowded. So a very easy way of differentiating yourself is using the data that you have as an online brand and going, okay, in London, in San Francisco, I know where my shopper lives. I don't have to be in a prime street. I'm going to go to a neighborhood. I'm going to open a beautiful store, and that's going to give me a lot more access to the shopper so they can trade up, so they can, we can increase their average spend, etc. It kind of goes back to the point that we were making also last week around the 50-minute city. I think online is really going to shift how brands look at cities because they have so much more data. 150 years ago, when really the only way to sell was to open stores, you kind of were doing it blindly. And I think now it's going to be the exact opposite. So it's really going to make the sort of gravity centers of our cities move and evolve over time.
I'm glad you mentioned the 50-minute city. I mean, it seems to be obviously originated in Paris, but it seems to be being picked up by a lot of other cities internationally, and it seems to involve providing everything that you would need within a sort of smallish area that's walkable. But I'm not sure if it would it work for London, because London is so much bigger. So people have sort of questioned whether that concept would work, and would the big brands go to Neasden, or I don't know, would they go to some more suburban parts of London?
I think it has the possibility of working, and I also think it's really important for us not to perhaps get fixated on a rigid idea of what the high street will look like for everyone, because not every 15-minute radius is composed of the same, genders, ages. It doesn't have the same densities. And so every high street doesn't need the same thing. So I still think that naturally you will have perhaps more exposure to international brands the closer you get to the city center. But as you move out into zones 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you will have more what I would call more neighborhood uses. And that isn't just this kind of romantic idea of fishmongers and butchers and candlestick makers. I think it's a lot about, what that community actually needs. Do they want vintage shops? Do they want, bookstores instead of apparel stores? Do they need more food stores because they currently don't have access to specific things, or the local Tesco doesn't provide for it? So I do think it is possible, but I think each neighborhood will find its balance.
Yes, you mentioned vintage, and I'm surprised that we haven't seen more pre-loved clothing stores, albeit, charity shops, but perhaps a little bit more sort of fashion orientated, because you go to Japan and, the kids there just seem to love vintage, pre-loved, and everywhere you go, there are these stores with sort of really interesting, old sort of army surplus or old kimonos, but we don't seem to have that much of it in the UK.
I think we're starting to see it. And again, going back to the point of how department stores should be a part of the high street, that's a really good example. Selfridges have been pioneers in this. So they've done kind of physical representations of things like Depop, things like Vestia Collective in their stores, and it's worked beautifully. I'm lucky enough to know a brand who work in the aftercare space, so they repair shoes and handbags. They're called the Restory, and again, the Restory now has permanent spaces in Harvey Nichols, Harrods, Selfridges, and hopefully soon in Europe. And I think the point of that is the department store at heart is a place where you go to not just buy things that you can find everywhere else, but more to the point, to find services and products that you can't find anywhere else. And I think that's their role in the high street.
Things seem to have gone full circle, because I'm thinking, the earlier days of Selfridges, where you go down to the basement and, there'd be somewhere to get, keys cut, shoes repaired. And
Tombsons, I remember.
Yeah, and that all disappeared, and it all became, very, very, very upmarket. So it would be good to get back to that sort of thing. And while we're on the subject of repurposing, I know that you've talked in the past about repurposing, because in a lot of cases retail assets are going to have to be repurposed. If we're going down to 50% retail from effectively what was 100%, what do you see the future for unneeded retail on the high street? We talked, obviously, permitted development rights. People are talking about putting more residential on the high street, but I'm not sure how you retain the idea is somewhere where people can meet, community. You've talked about the sort of experiential side. If you just suddenly convert a whole lot of high street shops to residential, there is the possibility you have lost that forever.
Yeah, I do think there's a risk that you could lose the vibrancy. I think there are two solutions that in my mind should be put at the forefront in this discussion. One is giving retailers the sort of planning flexibility to have those community style uses. So a lot of retailers already have supper clubs, for example, or they run yoga classes or Pilates classes in their stores. Give them the benefit of doing that on a regular basis without the need or the fear that a council could come after them to say, you can't use your space like that. The other part of the equation for me is the whole idea around making things, because that's really, it's vibrant. People love to see people making things. So for me, we need to bring things like 3D printing into the high street, because that will be a huge thing for our high streets in 10, 15, 20 years. I think we need to bring back and actually kind of take advantage of what's already happening, making food in the high street. Like, what about dark kitchens, or what about spaces that are just collaborative spaces where restaurants, cafes, and bars can exist effectively under the same roof, but utilizing the space as the day goes on? Because a baker needs a space at 4 a.m, right after the bar closes, arguably. But wouldn't that be beautiful? It would certainly be a much more useful way of using our rather limited real estate. And I do think, again, it just brings vibrancy. People want to know that there are things happening in the high street. And I think even kind of anthropologically, we're drawn to that. We're drawn to where things are happening, where people are, experiencing things. So we need to bring that back. It can't just be, I think you're right, it can't just be about residential and offices and there you go, we found the solution.
Yes, going back to the 50-minute city, it was interesting hearing that they're using spaces, as you say, that are redundant at certain times of the day. So when a school is closed, they're using the school playground, and they're using the school as a local hub for activities outside school hours, and also using car parks that are underused. So, what you're saying is we need to really sort of think completely outside the box in terms of how we use different spaces at different times of the day and week, which is going to be an interesting journey. So let's talk a little bit about the role of the retail landlord. Since everything is changing, I imagine that as the landlord, you can't now just be the person that collects rent and sees the tenant on rent review. So how do you see that role changing? How's it changed, and how do you think it's going to work going forward?
It's becoming a partnership, really, and I think that's probably easier said than done. I mean, we have been behaving like this, or at least I'd like to think we have, for a long time before COVID. But again, I think COVID has accelerated that. And when I talk about partnership, I think there's a lot of willingness, I think, on both parts now to be a bit more open, a bit more transparent, to understand that retailers need stores. They need them to be, profitable for the most part. There's a few exceptions, I would say, but there has to be an understanding on our part that they are there to make money, and they can't just be paying rent because it's a beautiful store in a beautiful part of town in a prime street. That's just not good enough. So we have a lot of work to do in that sense of understanding it. We also have a lot of work to do to bring data to the table, because again, online gives you a lot of data on your customer. How often do they click, how many things do they put in their basket? And I know we can't replicate that physically, but there's a lot of data that we as landlords can provide, almost sort of to say, our job is to make everything that happens outside your storefront as exciting as it can possibly be. Our job is to bring people to the area, and then your job, if we do all of this for you, is then to share your data with us. So we're not just talking, in my opinion, about revenue sharing. We're not just talking about turnover leases. I want to believe that we can have a good enough relationship with tenants that they can come to us and say, hey, we've noticed that there's more Australians coming to this part of town. Have you thought about having brands that maybe resonate more with them? Because that's data that we may not necessarily be able to capture, and certainly not in real time. So I think this idea of partnership really is, opening up our books on both sides of the fence and understanding that we're in it together.
And do you think that tenants are willing to do that? I mean, I'm thinking of a comment that Ross Bailey made in one of the ULI panels last week, and there was a conversation about data and data sharing, and his comment was that tenants tend to be suspicious of landlords, and they're more likely to be willing to share their data with Apple than to share data with the landlord, which seemed a little bit sad. But do you see that? Is this part of the partnership building, that you have to create this relationship of trust before your tenants will share data with you?
Absolutely. And you at the end of the day, you're also providing service to them. As you said right at the beginning, it's not just about providing them with four walls and saying you owe me rent. It's about providing something that kind of adds value to their business. So the point about data, the point about trying to do everything you possibly can to bring people to their door. So I do think, yes, there's more work to do, but I also think the UK market, for instance, is very archaic in that regard. Of course, you be suspicious of a landlord because we have 5-yearly, for the most part, upward only rent reviews. So if I give you information as a tenant, are you going to use that against me? Funnily enough, that doesn't happen in Asia because you do not have rent reviews. You just have annually indexed rents. You have the same broadly across Europe. You have a very similar structure in the US. So perhaps Ross's comment is more, I would say, more relevant to the UK, but he is right. We have more work to do, but it is not impossible. And again, to cite Raymond Chow and what he was saying about their experience at Hong Kong Land, it is possible, that they've even moved brands that were on fixed rents to completely variable rents through COVID. I mean, that's amazing.
And do you see that happening in the UK?
Very much so. It's going to be very painful. There's a lot of reticence, certainly on our part of the table, because I think as developers, investors, landlords, to take a sort of unilateral hit on the value of your asset is simply not fair. We've had zero help through the crisis, and yet tenants have had a great amount of help, be it through business rates, be it through several furlough schemes, small business schemes. And I'm not questioning the validity of them, quite the opposite. But what I am saying is, equally, we cannot be expected to bear the brunt of the adjustment of retail rents as we move into a completely new kind of world where performance-linked leases become the norm. So the lenders have a lot of work to do on that front. The valuers have a lot of work to do. And again, it's about coming together and understanding that this is the way forward, but that we cannot go from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. It's just not possible.
So what do you think is going to drive it? Because as you say, there is a lot to do, sort of moving from a situation where we've had sort of 5 long leases, 5-yearly upward only rent reviews, and if you go sort of back to basics and you start talking about we are talking about shorter leases and turnover rents. How are valuers going to change the way they value? How are lenders going to come to terms with a completely new system, and will that have an effect on the value of retail property?
I think they have to start thinking about valuing retail spaces in a slightly different way. I mean, for instance, when you talk about F&B, restaurants, cafes and the likes, and arguably fitness business, it really is a model that is perhaps more alike to a hotel. I mean, it's an operator-based model, and there is a limit to how much money you can make, because there's a limit to how many people physically you can have in a Pilates class or a whatever, or a HIIT class. And the same goes for, number of seats and number of turns that you have a day in a restaurant or a cafe. So I think that has to become part of the equation for F&B. I think for retail, I mean, look, I don't have all the answers, but I have an inkling that covenant should matter a bit more than it currently does. I mean, we're having conversations right now with valuers around, should the yield of an asset not be keener if you have arguably one of the biggest companies in the world signed on a 10, 15, 20-year lease? I personally think that still counts for something, regardless of where the market is or where the cycle is. So I think covenant needs to count for a lot more than it currently does. And I think where things will start to change is big brands and bigger landlords taking the plunge and proving, as soon as we start to build a track record and we have some sort of base rents that kicking, some sort of ratchets, and we can really start seeing that turnover does provide an upside to whatever the rent was before, that's where the tipping point will be. But I think we are all relying, and I'm certainly looking at some of the big landed estates in London, for instance, some of the big landlords out of Hong Kong, out of China, out of the US, because I think they're the ones that are going to do this first, and then we will all hopefully be able to follow suit with the valuers and the lenders in agreement, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And since everything is more international now, and so many of these brands are across the world, if it works, if it works in Hong Kong, if it works in New York, then it can work. It can work in the UK as well. But you can see why landlords and lenders might prefer to hang on to to the old regime. And do you have any thoughts about the Chancellor's plan to do away with tax-free shopping? I mean, at the moment we're not seeing many tourists, but hopefully they will be coming back soon, and we want to make sure that London is competitive as possible. So it doesn't seem like a terribly good idea.
I think it's really sad, and I think that they're leaving a lot on the table. And someone who has the privilege of also working in cities like Paris, I can see already, I can see the change in the language that brands are using around London. I can see that they are probably already thinking, oh, well, if London is going to perhaps see a dip in spend from overseas tourists, then where are they going to go, and where should I be redeploying, redirecting my capital? Should it be Paris? Should it be Frankfurt? Should it be Munich? A lot of the brands that I talk to, perhaps because our portfolio is slightly skewed towards luxury, are some of the big luxury groups. And they're fairly chilled about the decision insofar as they're very diversified themselves, and they can see that, they still have the ability to follow the customer. But as I said at the beginning, we're leaving so much on the table, and I fail to understand why we are just deciding that it's not worth it when it's worth billions to the London economy. And however that plays politically, the truth is people come to London because it is one of the greatest cities on the planet, because they want to come and visit, our beautiful parks, our museums, Buckingham Palace, etc. So if we don't make it easy for them to shop here, they're just going to go somewhere else, or they're just going to come here for a shorter amount of time and spend less. And that's really sad.
It is really sad, because you can see, the brands of, as you say, looking and saying, well, okay, so, perhaps we focus more on Paris, or, we focus more on, Amsterdam. So what should we be doing to encourage them back? Because obviously once things start, reopening, once people start traveling again, what can we do in the UK to sort of be more attractive than say Paris?
I think the answer has to lie on placemaking and public spaces. I was so excited to see. I saw yesterday for the first time the CGI of the Marble Arch. Meanwhile, what do you call it? Hill, I suppose, that they're thinking of doing.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's so clever. I mean, I think using public spaces that already exist, using greenery, using public art and culture to activate spaces. It doesn't cost us a lot. It's really clever. It's incredibly inclusive because it doesn't cost the consumer anything either. It provides them, an opportunity to sit, to dwell, to chill out. That's so important. And that has to be one of the main ways we get people to come into town, because again, I just don't think shops are good enough anymore. I don't even think restaurants per se are good enough anymore. I mean, I want to get into a shop and into a restaurant as much as the next person, but I don't think I'm going to rush out the door the minute lockdown is lifted. I need something more.
And actually, as you were talking about, this hill and the experience, I'm sort of thinking about Instagram, because, everything, you look at everything in the context of, okay, how will this, how will this look on Instagram? I suppose it's the same for, the restaurants and the shops and everything, but, it gets back to the experiential side of it.
And culture, I just think we have so much of it. Again, London is so lucky in that we have some of the best museums, and they're for free, which is something so unique. Anywhere else you travel in the world, you have to spend a lot of money to get into some of these museums. What about bringing those museums out onto, the squares, the parks, the streets? That could be so exciting. I still remember that in Paris. I don't know if this happens here, so forgive my ignorance, but in Paris you have what they call the White Nights, and White Nights is sort of 1 week long. In summer, you can go to the museums at night, and therefore there's a lot less people, obviously, and you get a totally different experience. And again, what about the nighttime economy? What are we doing to kind of revive that? What are we doing to bring people into town? It doesn't just have to be about going for, I don't know, a meal and a really late night cab. It could also be about museums and theatre. I think culture is really the answer here.
I think that's a really interesting idea, because I think Tel Aviv also does the white night.
Wow.
I mean, maybe this is something we should address with Amy Lalme, because this idea of using spaces 24/7, I mean, it would be a brilliant idea to be able to go to some of these museums outside normal. I mean, we have late night sort of visiting now, but and then I'm just thinking, when you're talking about bringing the museum outside, take the Wallace collection. I mean, it's sits there in beautiful green square. If one could actually bring some of the sort of action activities outside, because so many people actually walk past it. I'm convinced people walk from Selfridges, to Wigmore Street,
Yes.
and beyond. They have no idea that the Wallace collection is there. So we could make a lot of these things more visible. So Yes, there's a lot to do, and I sort of mentioned at the beginning that you host your own podcast, which you call Retail is Dead. But I know that you don't think that retail is dead. So what's that all about?
So it was an ironic name. I co-hosted with two of my very close friends, Leanne Cattrall, who works at the Crown Estate and manages Regent Street retail, and Erin McDonald, who works at CBRE and also is in retail leasing. And we honestly have just grown so fed up of people talking ill of retail and talking about retail and F&B in such a negative light that we thought we wanted to create a space, a little corner on the internet, if you like, where we would just talk about positive things relating to retail. So we talk about spaces, we talk about brands, we talk about places that get it right. And we interview people who we think are kind of fighting the good fight. So they might be small business operators, or they might be architects, or they might be master planners, and they're sort of talking to us about how retail is evolving and concepts that are really making a difference. So it's really exciting, and it's a nice way to kind of bring together what we are already thinking and kind of putting it out there in a kind of neat little podcast package.
I think that's brilliant. I think the title is absolutely great as well. And in terms of your career to date, what do you reckon? What has been the best career decision? And is there anything, with the advantage of hindsight, you would have done differently?
Oh, that's a great question. Probably career highlight was moving to Hong Kong on a secondment. I followed my heart because my husband was already moving to Asia, and I thought, if I don't do it now, when will I do it? And it really was an eye-opening experience. I had never quite appreciated just how much more advanced cities like Seoul, like Tokyo, Osaka, Shanghai are in terms of retail and, you know, the experience element of it. And it changed my life. It really did. It made me think about retail in a completely new dimension. It really opened my eyes to the sort of F&B and leisure world too, in a way that I hadn't really been interested in before. In hindsight, probably the only thing I regret is not moving there for a bit longer, or maybe trying a different city. I am forever in love with Japan and all things Japanese. And there was a small chance that I could have gone to Tokyo, and yeah, I definitely regret that now. But, you know, never say never. I mean, the world is our oyster, really.
Yes, well, I hope it goes back to being our oyster. And I agree with you. I agree with you about Japan. I mean, it is pretty sort of inspiring, and there's some things there that are just, you know, quite crazy. I mean, we've talked a little bit about, you know, some of the themed cafes, and I don't, maybe you know, talking about the experiential, we could do with cat cafes, or, you know, dog cafes, or maybe that wouldn't comply with you know, the various sort of food hygiene regulations. I don't know, but you know, that would be sort of quite a nice thing to have on your Knightsbridge estate.
Definitely. No, it's a really good point. And, you know, jokes aside, I do think, going back to our earlier points around inclusivity, we also need to start thinking of the high street in a slightly different way. You know, it's not all about Gen Z. It's not all about millennials. What we call the so-called silver pound want? What do they want? What do kids want? Why are there so many places where it really isn't convenient to bring your kids along? Why are there so many places that don't accept pets? We need to change that, because again, otherwise, if you make it hard, if you create paths of resistance for people to come into town, dwell, spend time, spend money, they will choose another route. They will choose something more convenient, always. That's just how we're wired.
And we're hearing about, you know, so many people during lockdown have you know, have taken on puppies. I have just I've just acquired a little cockapoo puppy myself. So
Nice.
you know, I'm immediately thinking, okay, well, so what happens, you know, when I'm able, you know, we can go out again, and I can go you know, go shopping, I can go to a restaurant. What happens to the puppy? Because most places you can't take animals to. I think Selfridges do have a sort of slightly dog-friendly rule.
Like concierge, no?
No,
Yeah.
you can,
I've seen the doorman, like he waits with the puppy, doesn't he? It's the cutest thing.
No, apparently you can take the dog in, but its feet I think can't touch the floor, so it can either be, you can carry it or have it in a bag, but I don't think it's allowed to roam free. But you actually can take a dog there. But so you're right, so many shops you can't, cafes you can't. And I know in the past I've had to sort of try and sort of hide my dog under the tablecloth in a cafe, and then they see this paw sticking out and you get thrown out. So I think you're absolutely right. If we want people to spend time on the high street, we need to make it as simple as possible. So that's something to think about for our next podcast, Rebecca. So I think it's a good place to end, and thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today to share your invaluable insights into the world of global retail and how we should expect retail to evolve in the years ahead. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please join us for the next Propertyshe podcast interview coming very soon. The Propertyshe podcast is brought to you by Mishcon de Rare in association with the London Real Estate Forum and can be found at mishcon.com/propertyshe, along with all our interviews and programme notes. The podcasts are also available to subscribe to on your Apple Podcast app and on Spotify and whatever podcast app you use. Do continue to subscribe and let us have your feedback and comments, and most importantly, suggestions for future guests. And of course, you can continue to follow me on Twitter at Propertyshe and on LinkedIn for a very regular commentary on all things real estate, prop tech, and the built environment.